Africa is being looked to as the last new major market. On this continent with a population of 1.3 billion, seeing yearly economic growth of about 5%, every country is watching Africa with intense interest. The nations of Africa are undergoing dramatic change. Even in areas without access to banking or infrastructure like telephone lines, smartphone use is spreading rapidly. And as electronic payment systems using virtual currencies progress, people's lives are being completely transformed. In areas without well-maintained roads, drones are being put to use saving lives by quickly transporting vaccines and blood to hospitals. Having developed its plentiful natural energy resources, such as oil and natural gas, Africa is looking to the IT and high-tech sectors to create a new engine to power further development in the 21st century and beyond. However, another side of continued population growth is severe food shortages. The income divide between the growing middle class and the poor is a major issue. In late August, leaders from many African nations gathered in Yokohama to discuss the future of Africa. The 7th Africa Development Conference, TICAD 7, was held from August 28th to the 30th, with leadership-level participants from 42 of the 54 African nations present. Efforts to foster sustainable development through the expansion of high-transparency financing, human resource development, and other means were discussed. A symposium was held during TICAD 7 to discuss the following topics: how to attract investment from around the world, how to foster the youth who will sustain Africa's future, what is required for the further development of Africa. Today, we bring you part 1 of this program, which will be broadcast over the next 2 weeks.
As you know, Africa is a vibrant continent. It is home to rich natural resources and a booming population. The UN says by 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. Africa's economic growth is projected to rise to 4% in 2019. Now, these figures continue to impress both developed and developing economies, and the shift is taking place from aid towards trade and investment. But challenges do remain as to if that robust economy will bring about inclusive and equitable growth to the continent. As the world faces the rise of nationalism and protectionism that pose a major challenge to the global economy. So the question today is, now what is the way forward for Africa and for governments and businesses that are keen to engage Africa? Mr. Barr, doing business is not just about pursuing economic gains. No, it is about having the right infrastructure, reducing corruption, improving regulations and business practices, and many more if a country wants to realize that gain. Now, what measures have you taken in Senegal to attract investment from abroad?
Indeed, Africa as a whole is a virgin continent that needs a lot of investment.
Former head of the National Revenue Authority and Cabinet Finance Minister, Amadou Ba, became Senegal's Minister of Foreign Affairs in April this year. With a population of 15 million, Senegal has had a democratically elected government since its independence from France in 1960, and is one of the most politically stable African countries. Agriculture and fisheries are its main industries, but recently it has been actively seeking outside investment, particularly from China.
It can be said that the whole continent of Africa is under construction. So it is also another reality, and it represents a potential market of 1 billion people, a young population, and it's 30 million square kilometers. What interests the investor is whether there are established laws in place or not. To capture his interest and make him act, there needs to be an environment where there is predictability. To me, this seems extremely important. Our countries have developed legal tools to reassure investors. To me, this seems to be an important aspect nowadays. In addition to the fundamental aspects of stability, peace, security, and democracy, which are likely to attract private investments. Japanese companies are already doing business on the African continent, which I welcome. Senegal hosts a fairly large multinational Japanese company, Kagome, not to name it, who works in the north of Senegal and who works in the tomato business, as in Japan, and has projects in other countries.
One Japanese company doing business in Senegal is the major food manufacturer, Kagome. Since December 2017, they've leased farmland to grow tomatoes for food production. Using proprietary seeds and cultivation techniques, the tomatoes grown by the food manufacturer are locally processed in Senegal. Tomatoes were once widely produced in Senegal, but due to the pressure from cheap imports, much of the arable land went unused. So, under the motto, local production for local consumption, Kagome leased the land and began production. In the future, they aim to sell a wide range of processed tomato products in partnership with local businesses.
And this is where private investment is important. Now, what is good, from my point of view, is that states have to give a lot of information to companies and must support companies. I think it is important when an entrepreneur, whether they are Japanese, Chinese, German, or Polish, moves to a country the person doesn't know and works, they will do better if there are easy-to-understand rules. Today, Africa is taking charge of itself. Africa needs infrastructure. Africa needs to create employment. Africa is a zone where added value can be created. Africa is a safe zone. Africa is a zone where one does business, that person can repatriate their profits, or at least export toward the continent. The government itself has to study and analyze how to bring in more investment from abroad to find what is necessary to realize this. In other words, by thinking from the point of view of the private sector, we, the government, should strengthen the relationship between Japan and Senegal, and moreover, between Japan and Africa. We want to analyze today's international cooperation and come up with basic rules for business.
Dr. Okonjo, you have depths of experience working for the international organizations as well as two-time finance minister of Nigeria.
Gavi Vaccine Alliance Chairman, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a Nigerian economist. She served as Minister of Finance and Foreign Minister, and also held an important position at the World Bank.
Would I be right in saying that where procedures are complex or unclear, the likelihood of corruption is higher? That is according to the World Bank report. While less time and bureaucratic hurdles and better regulations may lead to productivity and competitiveness. Has that become a common understanding in Africa?
I would say that with respect to what is needed for growth, what is needed for private investment, it's become very clear. African countries, African policymakers accept and know that clearing away bureaucratic hurdles is a very, very important part of having a good business environment. So you need, if you want a good business environment that can attract the private sector, both domestic, I hasten to say, as well as foreign, then you have to make sure you clear away the bureaucratic hurdles, that you maintain transparency in the way you handle your accounts, and that you try to limit corruption. I think this is now accepted. And I think that many African countries have been doing very well in trying to climb up the ranks of the doing business that was referred to. Rwanda in particular has made tremendous progress, but also several other countries on the continent are trying to do that, including my own country, Nigeria. So this is critically important. Why is it important to clear away bureaucratic hurdles to avoid corruption? We need to grow to create jobs. One of the biggest challenges facing the continent is the fact that today we have 420 million young people, according to ILO statistics. And, you know, we have a lot of underemployment and unemployment. And we want these youth between 15 to 35, they're a precious resource. And if we want to make sure we get a demographic dividend out of them, we have to clear away all hurdles so we can create jobs and support them also to be entrepreneurs and have productive employment within the economy.
Professor Stiglitz, you are an economist, and you have warned before that it would be naive to expect to replicate Asian miracle in Africa. What did you mean by that?
Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001, continues to offer advice on how to reduce inequality in each country from an economic perspective.
Well, the Asian miracle was the fact that the countries of East Asia have grown more rapidly than anybody had anticipated 50 years ago. And it was based on manufacturing export-led growth. And the expansion of manufacturing in Japan first, and then spread to the other countries of East Asia, provided employment, it provided foreign exchange, it provided a basis of learning which closed the knowledge gap between the East Asian countries and the more advanced countries. It did all these things together. But in manufacturing, there's been so much success in increasing productivity that global employment is going down. Basically, the growth of productivity has exceeded the growth in demand. And then that fits in with the growth in population that we just heard about. Between now and 2100, there will be about more than 2 billion more entrants into the labor force. More than 100% of the growth in the world labor force is going to be in Africa. And that's going to mean enormous increases in jobs. But manufacturing won't be able to provide all those jobs. You know, just to give you a number, if all the manufacturing jobs left China, it would be about 85 million. That just makes a dent in the 2 billion that are going to be needed. So that means Africa is going to need a multifaceted, multi-pronged approach where exports will be important, but domestic demand will be important, manufacturing will be important, but so will agriculture, and so will the service sector. So it's a bigger challenge, but in this portfolio of sectors, you can accomplish what East Asia did in just manufacturing, but it's going to be more difficult.
I think that the aspiration of, in every country, I would hasten to say, people aspire to move out of poverty, to be wealthier, to be able to take care of their families and their children, and to move into the middle class. And I think within Africa, we are beginning to see an emerging middle class. And there are different estimates for whether it's a quarter now of the population or a third of the population, but that is definitely emerging. And that is creating some domestic demand, some consumer demand that will be necessary to propel growth. This is what Professor Stiglitz was referring to. So that's what we need to work on. But to do that, we really have to focus on, as I said, creating jobs, trying to create that middle class, but supporting entrepreneurship. I really believe in that. One of the best characteristics of what we have on the continent is a very vibrant entrepreneurial population. And I believe that it's not, of course, government doesn't create enough jobs. It's not even the big private sector. The question we have is how can we support our young people and our women in particular to grow their enterprises that they're managing today and scale them up and create more jobs.
Right. Dr. Kitaoka, we know that Japan was a frontrunner in terms of aid and investment in Africa. What is the renewed realization on the part of Japan in terms of the role it can play today in Africa?
The leading body for Japan's international cooperative efforts, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA, hopes to strengthen ties with Africa.
We are trying to encourage Japanese business to go to Africa because Africa will become a very big market with a huge population of young people. And then this is very important. If Africa can grow in a steady pace under the very wise leadership of the African leaders, then that will become a very important market. But if African development may fail, then international community has to take care of this. It's a heavy burden to the international community. Therefore, it is a very important time for us to decide. And now JICA is providing assistance, and we are encouraging the small and medium-sized businesses in local area which have the innovative ideas and techniques to go to Africa so that we can make a good matching between the demand in Africa and then in the supply from Japan. So I think it's a very good combination. And then I am finding the growing interest in the small and medium-sized businesses to go to Africa.
Absolutely.
And I think this will continue.
Thank you.
China has been actively investing in Africa. In Senegal's capital city, Dakar, in addition to a huge sports stadium, there is an art museum. There is a theater that resembles the People's Hall in Beijing, and other buildings built free of charge by China scattered around the city. A 115-kilometer highway connecting Dakar with the outlying provinces was built by a Chinese company. The total construction cost was $800 million, 85% of which was borrowed from China at an annual interest rate of 2%. While it could be said that China is contributing to vital infrastructure, there is also the view that such practices may catch Africa in a debt trap. The Yokohama Declaration, announced at TICAD 7, also touched on the importance of ensuring a sound financial situation for African countries, with the influence of China in mind.
China now does more trade with Africa than any other country. China's president visited your country last year with loans that financed infrastructure like the highway. But your president says he has a positive view of China. What did he mean by that?
Africa has long been colonized by European countries, especially France, the United Kingdom, Spain, and Portugal. But what is important today is that Africa is no one's preserve. I think the world has changed enough, and our countries have needs for huge investment and construction. Even investment policy can lead to problems in terms of debts. I think these questions need to be properly analyzed.
I understand Chinese aid or investment is often more sought after. People say that the credits and loans tend to be fast, flexible, and often with lesser conditions. But what would that mean to the governance of the country?
The problem is that sometimes there is corruption. You have to have strict procedures to make sure the money goes. The country is going to own money. You can get debt, but if you don't have something to show for it, you're going to be really worse off, not better off. So that's where, there's a little bit of bureaucracy, but the reason we have those bureaucratic rules is to prevent money disappearing. And yes, there's a cost to bureaucracy, there's a cost to accountability, but there is even a greater cost to non-accountability. So when you talk about bureaucracy, part of the reason we have that is to make sure things work well. And the challenge is always to get the minimal amount of bureaucracy, to get the maximum amount of accountability, so the money actually goes to the objectives for which it's supposed to go.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
In the second half of the panel discussion, Rwanda's Minister of Trade and Industry joined in place of Senegal's Foreign Minister, Amadou Ba. After serving as a board member of a major European financial institution, she was appointed Minister of Trade and Industry last year. Rwanda is a landlocked country with a population of 12 million. 25 years ago, over 800,000 people were killed as the result of ethnic conflict. Moving forward, the strong leadership of President Paul Kagame helped to overcome the conflict and restore stability to the country. They are now working to become an IT nation and have achieved a high economic growth rate of 6 to 8% per year.
So, Dr. Okonjo, let me start with you. You have spoken earlier about the need for an inclusive growth. And as you said, Africa has the world's youngest population, where, according to one UN statistics, 200 million are between 15 and 24. But because many lack the skills or the education needed for decently paid jobs, 70% of Africa's youth live on less than $2 a day. What steps do you see as crucial to bringing about growth that is more equitable?
I think there are 2 or 3 things. The first is, what do the youth want themselves? When you talk to them, they want jobs, they want support for entrepreneurship, to be able to use their talents to create jobs not only for themselves but for others. They want access to skills that will enable them be productive in the new world. And I'm talking about technology. Many of them are now tech savvy, so we need to support that. They want good education. If you talk to them, they feel that the education that we have today is no longer as relevant to the future. We don't know what the jobs of the future will be. So we need to train them with the kind of thinking and analytical skills that will be needed. And thirdly, they want to have access to services. They want good infrastructure where they live. They want good services where they live. I think these are basic things that people elsewhere have, and our youth are asking for the same.
Mm-hmm.
I believe Africa's greatest asset is its young people, and also I think making sure that, one, they have access to all the skills that they can get, so that even in their innovations, it's really geared at finding solutions that are targeted to the problems that the different countries have. And the second thing is also, how do we bring in now private sector into the mix, and especially in the Japanese companies? How do we make sure that they get access about the new Africa, the opportunities that there are, but also being transparent enough on the risk, and also how to mitigate them. And I think that's very important to set.
And disparity can often create pockets of resentment in certain societies that could lead to instability and breed violence and terrorism in the worst case.
Absolutely. As I say, we have 420 million young people now between the age of 15 to 35. I see them as a resource, and so do most African policymakers. But for them to remain a resource, we must make sure they are productively engaged. And if we don't, then, we've seen examples of what it can mean in terms of revolution. Maybe not terrorism, but you can have youth, migrating to other places. You can have them engaging in activities that are counterproductive. We hope we won't get there, and we'll be able to do the necessary to keep them on the continent, keep them engaged, and keep them producing for Africa.
Some worry that jobs do need to be created, decent jobs that offer decent pay. But in some cases, with the spread of AI or IT, the vulnerable, unskilled workers may be put into a more vulnerable situation and be not be fitted to compete in the labour market to go ahead. Do you see this as a challenge, Professor Stiglitz?
Oh, yes, it's clearly a challenge. It's even broader than that. One of the comparative advantages of Africa has been a large labor supply. But particularly in manufacturing, labor is going to become less important because robots will take over a lot of the jobs. I mentioned before that manufacturing export-led growth is not going to play the role that it did in East Asia. One aspect of that is there's been onshoring. Some of the production is coming back to advanced countries, but it's not done by humans, it's being done by robots. And so it's not creating jobs in the United States or in Europe. And so that's why the development strategy that's going to be successful has to have an important component looking at agriculture, because that's going to be where a lot of the absorption. It has to look at the informal sector, the service sector, and that's one of the areas where Rwanda has been particularly successful. And the question is, will they be able to create enough jobs for the burgeoning population?
Join us next week to see the second half of this panel discussion on African development. This program was made possible by the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA.